Hey everyone, thanks for being here. We'll go ahead and get started. Hey Brittany, you can have your video on if you want.
Oh my goodness, I look a sight. So that is okay.
Okay. Well, hey, Brittany's here. She's been dealing with sickness, so unfortunately she's not in the room this evening, but she's with us on the Zoom. That's Brittany Butler. She's one of our moderators. So I'm kind of filling in this evening with Michelle Treece. I'm Sky McFarland. And we are coming to you from the Gillespie building here in Jonesboro. It is where the food pantry is. This is kind of like our satellite studio for the McKinney Center. So we're really excited for our guests this evening, and we're going to focus on some Black history. Just because you don't have your video on or you're muted doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. So please, please, please ask questions, make comments in the chat so we can include you in this conversation this evening. And I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Michelle, and she'll probably throw it to our guests. So thank you for being with us this evening.
Yay, it's good to see you folks. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And like always, I like to have each person introduce themselves. So we'll go with Megan first.
Hold on. I
Hope
gotta
you
turn my
guys-
camera on.
Some of these people.
There you go.
There you are.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Dr. Megan Cullen-Tewell. I have a Ph.D. in public history from North Carolina State University, and I am a public history practitioner here in East Tennessee, as well as an adjunct professor at a couple local universities. And my research is on carceral history in the United States, so histories of crime, punishment, and imprisonment. And a lot of that actually intersects with the Black experience, which I've taught on and studied as well in different ways. So I look forward to being here and having this talk today.
Great. You said you went to, is it North Carolina State?
It is.
Where is that?
It's in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Okay, groovy.
Yep.
All right, and Dr. Carter, who are you?
Hi, I'm Dr. Daryl Carter. I am a tenured full professor of history, director of Black American Studies, and associate dean for equity and inclusion in the College of Arts and Sciences at East Tennessee State University. I hold a BS and M.A. from ETSU and a Ph.D. from the University of Memphis. I am an American political historian. I'm also an expert in African American history. And my first book was on President Clinton and the politics of race and class. My current work deals with contemporary and recent modern history as it relates to African Americans and politics and the such. So I'm tickled to be here with my colleague and look forward to the next 55 minutes or so.
Yay. Well, it's the famous Black History Month, folks.
Yes.
Woohoo. Y'all celebrate?
Every day.
Every day. Every day.
Twice on Sunday.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, well, the first question I have on my list here is, what do you think we could do to make Black History Month a better month? What can we do to make it a better thing?
Do you mind if I have an
Sure.
initial thought? And I'm sure that there are many valuable thoughts on how Black History Month can develop and grow, and it's incredibly relevant to today. But I think that there are also ways with all historical topics that it can continue to become even more relevant and applicable. But one of the things I think it's really important is that we actually move beyond some of the starter conversations in Black history and some of the starter topics and themes that have been covered over and over again. And while really important, don't really get us to that next phase of provocation, understanding, interpretation, engagement. So I think one of the things that we need to consider as we engage with Black History Month and as we consider it and what it means is what's next. You know, what's beyond the basics of Black history, and what does that space look like, and what can we get out of it? So I think that that's a very forward-thinking approach to the month, and a little more abstract, but an important consideration for moving forward.
I think that's a great point, Megan. And I also say that when we talk about Black History Month, Black history is American history. It's not separate. You cannot have America without Black people.
Mhm.
And not just in the context of America's original sin, slavery, but even in the contemporary context. We're living here in the Appalachian Highlands, in which we have the birthplace of country music just a few miles up the road in Virginia, on the Virginia side. But you can't have country music without Black people in the banjo.
Mhm.
And what we need to do is to not what I call find a Black person month, right? But we need to more deeply and richly incorporate that experience into our broader discussions about the country, to get a much more realistic and rich interpretation and understanding of this country, its history, and its present.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think that it's so important because what happens with Black History Month so often, it seems, is it gets historicized. We talk about it in very distant temporal ways to where there's a disconnect between ourselves and the content we're talking about, and bridging that past and present and making Black History Month do something, activating it, energizing it, I think is such a good idea. And also recognizing the dynamic aspect of Black history. So often the struggle is discussed, which is an incredibly important and foundational aspect of Black history, and the freedom struggle of African Americans. But at the same time, what else? What about the joys and the lives and the work and the household? What other aspects do we cover in American history generally that somehow get glossed over, neglected, or overlooked when we do Black History Month? So I think maybe expanding the narrative a little bit too.
I agree with that. And, to go just a little bit further, when we study Black history, for example, we tend to put it always in relationship to whites and never just Black people as Black people. And that, I think, is something that is really, really important. And we have seen some interesting things that happen when Blacks are allowed to stand on their own, in terms of the story, as opposed to always in relation to white Americans, or in relation to slavery or Jim Crow or things of that nature. I'm thinking of that film, Megan, with the actor who just passed away, with a fantasy type of world. Wakanda or something.
Yes, Black Panther with Chadwick Boseman. Yeah.
Yes, and how irritated certain Americans were because they weren't a part of that story. And that's a really interesting thing. And so I agree with you. It can't just be the bad things. It has to be a much more comprehensive view of the Black experience, and allowing Blacks just to be Black, and not as something that is always relation to the majority population.
Sidney Poitier, I think, had a really great first African-American male Oscar winner, if I'm not mistaken, had a great quote about this with the press. And his exact quote was, "You ask me questions that center my Negroness in my life. It's centered on that, but I'm a man. I'm an actor. I'm a creator. I am so much more. And those are the questions I want to answer. I want to get away from that." And I think too, you touched on, Daryl, the fact that there's an assumption that Black is homogenous and Black history is homogenous. And so what we do is we then again gloss over all of the really intricate and complicated relationships between and in Black communities and with Black individuals, and and that is part of Black history too.
Absolutely. That idea that Blacks are monolithic, it's really insulting.
Yes.
It devalues Black people. It takes away Black agency. It dehumanizes and subjugates. And the fact of the matter is that the community, just like white Americans, just like Jewish Americans or Muslim Americans or anybody else, we have our deeply religious and righteous part of the community. We have our criminals, we have our intellectuals, we have our business people, we have our Southerners, our rural people. We're rich and diversity within the Black community, and that needs to be acknowledged as well, because the representation of Blackness on television is really at odds
Mm.
with what the experience of Black Americans really is. I mean, if you watch television, it is getting a little bit better, maybe, but it's still, it's basketball, it is rap music, it is urban, it is poor. I mean, you know, you're not seeing the richness that is the Black experience in terms of diversity within the community. And that's something that could be remedied. And we have some people that are trying to do that at the big three networks. A lot of the cable networks are now starting to engage in that. And we're starting to get not your one-off like the Cosby Show, but now you're seeing Black actors in other roles that they haven't been in ever.
Mhm.
And so as we grow as a society and the media portrayals of Blackness evolve and change, I think we're going to get a much more fuller representation of Black people.
I hope so.
When I think about, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, no,
I was just gonna ask Brittany's question for her. She's like, she's here. I'm just gonna speak the question out loud for her. She said, what do each of you think the fear or hesitation is among the general population with regard to moving beyond the basics?
Do you want to start with this one, and I'll
Sure.
jump in with the thought?
Well, I do think there's real fear about going beyond those basics there. I think a lot of people are deeply wedded to both myth and their own preconceptions about who Black people are. I think they are deeply wedded to their ideas of what whiteness means. And I think beyond that, there are people for whom if they go too far in digging into that area, it becomes extremely uncomfortable. You know as well as I do that whiteness, as it has been portrayed in America, is really ahistorical in key ways. The early Europeans would not have understood whiteness the way that we do today, and that part of the reason we have whiteness as we do today is because of the slave trade. And so that combined with very, very few people are homogenous racially. And when you do DNA testing on them, you find out, oh my goodness, that they've got ancestors in Africa and Europe and Asia and Latin America. That diversity there comes out, and that scares a lot of people. So I think that's a good place to start there. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that what we've seen, to answer Brittany's question and to respond to some of the things that you've mentioned, is that people interpret, they view this topic through the lens of self, right? And how it affects self. And if these changes that they see in their communities or their families or their nation, their legislation, the culture, whatever, they're going to view it through a sense of self and how it's going to affect them. And I see a lot of language around guilt and around accountability. Especially when you talk about issues of reparations or public commemoration in the form of statues of Black history, or, and I think it results in defensiveness and indignation. But what they're doing is they're filtering it through a sense of self, often of using that whiteness and as their identity. And because that is how they identify, when you threaten notions of whiteness, when you threaten notions of continuity, you're threatening, they view it as a threat to self. And so I think that what we have to do is get beyond that interpretation, and white individuals and white communities are going to have to understand that you're not, that it doesn't need to be viewed that way. This isn't about an individual person necessarily, right? This is about acknowledging large scale histories, group histories, histories of power and control, economics, poli-sci. So we're talking about bigger things than whether or not, you feel unduly attacked because of your identity with whiteness or affiliation with whiteness. So personally, I think that is going to be an ongoing challenge with some of these things.
I agree with you. And I would also say, this is not about any individual white American. Number one, we are more than 150 years past the Civil War. We are, at a point now where we are generations removed from slavery. It's not about individual guilt or anything like that. No white American has held anybody in slavery. The issue is recognizing the myriad and complex ways in which race and slavery have created the dynamics that are still impacting us now. There was a white paper that came out back in November from some economists that were looking at the congressional funding for small businesses, CARES grant type of funding, to keep them in business at the start of the pandemic. And they were looking specifically at white small businesses and Black small businesses seeking loans. And when Black small businesses went to local banks around the United States, more often than not, they would get turned down for those loans. But when they went to fintechs, these online banks that usually don't have brick and mortar setups, they were much, much more successful in getting it. And when they isolated all the variables and do what economists do, they figured out there's no other way to explain that beyond the race component. In many of those cases, you had similar economic data, economic resources, financial sheets, and balance sheets. There was no other way to explain that beyond that type of thing. And so you ask that question, okay, well, how is that possible? Well, that's possible because of a system that had developed as early as the late 1490s that devalued other human beings, that allowed the majority society to exploit that community over and over and over again, and it becomes baked into the country's DNA. And while the country has made tremendous progress, we are so much better off in key ways than what we were just since the 60s. Those things don't go away, in part because they become a part of that kind of framework that is faceless, colorless, that is just, it's more about systems now that it's been built into, whether it's incarceration or it's the banking system or it's athletics, sports, professional sports. We're having that discussion over
Home
NFL
ownership,
coach
yeah.
right now, home ownership, schooling and education. So there's a lot of things that go into that. And so it's not about saying, hey, you did something wrong or she did something wrong. It's about saying, look, we are an extremely complex society and country. These things developed over a period of time, and that's how they're still impacting us today.
And it's so interesting because, we're both educators, and I have the utmost respect for educators, come from a family of educators. But I do have to say, one of the common threads between both of our takes on this, I think, is poor history education. And I see it all the time, and I'm sure you do too, where you have students come into even general history classes as freshmen or sophomores in college, still believing mythologies, historical mythologies that they got during a public school education. And again, went to public school, have the utmost respect for teachers, especially with what they're doing. So thank you if any of you are educators. But I think we do have to just call a spade and say, poor history education is contributing to a citizenry that is not as informed about general history, but also Black history. And I see a lot of resistance when you present students, particularly white students with certain preconceived notions, with historical documents, with evidence. And they struggle to integrate it into their understanding of the world and of their country and of their region. So I think we need to do better. I think that our public education needs to be better, because there's no point and no benefit in not engaging with the actuality of history and what happened. It just delays progress. It delays all the good that can come out of that conversation. So that's one thing that I think needs to change. And you see it too with the whiteness or the conversations about whiteness that students have about their ancestors or about white people in the past. Not all white people owned slaves. Well, that's not the point, right? The point was their whiteness sheltered them from some of the negative effects of a growing economic system based on agriculture and enslaved labor. So it's not just about that, right? I mean, the other thing I think that you've mentioned indirectly, or that you've kind of referred to with some of your comments, Daryl, are colorblind policies. And I actually think people don't realize how harmful those are. It was kind of the woke phraseology and woke understanding of especially the 90s and the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. This idea of we're all the same and I don't see color. But what people don't realize is that that is harmful in its overlooking of fundamental differences to people's identity. You know, as a white woman, as an African-American man, we're going to experience the world differently, and people are going to interact with us differently. And so again, that's another thing that by not starting at that point, we're already starting a couple steps back. So I think some of the things, those are actual concrete things we can and should be working on to address.
Well, Megan, I think you bring up some excellent points. And let me point out, follow up on a couple that you mentioned. You mentioned history education. I couldn't agree more, where you have students who have no basic understanding of American history outside of what they've been taught in K through 12. And there's a couple problems with that setup, right? One is poor teaching at times, but it's not the teachers who are the problem. The problem is that the people who control what is taught in K through 12 public education are school boards and state bureaucrats. And school boards, generally speaking, with notable exceptions, with notable exception, are not professional educators. They are lay people who have a political motive, and they could be far left, they could be far right, but they're not professional educators. Educators use evidence, data, methods, etc. That's not what they do. And so you can see that in the state of Tennessee, where now they're going to have partisan school board races. And one elected official said something along the lines of, well, we should know what they're for. Well, maybe you should actually talk to them, because telling me you're a Democrat or Republican doesn't tell me anything about what you're going to do for the schools. It tells me what ideology you have. And okay, fair enough. That may be instructive in some ways, but it doesn't tell me how you're going to deal with things like the fact that so many kids are not prepared. That universities where we work are consistently, particularly on history, especially history, are having to go back and re-educate kids because they're being taught propaganda in a lot of scenarios. So we have to deal with that as well, because it's crippling young people. You know, I can't tell you, and I know you've experienced this too, where you have kids saying, I was never taught that. They never taught me that in high school. They never told me that in middle school. And it's like, okay, good grief, we're gonna have to go back here. And then these myths that are built up through K through 12 education, and parental groups and churches and other things that, you know, are really, you know, just out in left field type of stuff. So let me give you an example. This stuff about the founding fathers. We hear this language around the founding fathers. You know, they just wanted Judeo-Christian values. Really?
Even the atheist ones.
Yeah, even the atheist
even the
ones.
deist.
Yeah, like Jefferson.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So, but the fact of the matter is that every historian worth their salt and credentialed historian will tell you that the Enlightenment guided their ideals arguably more than anything else.
Absolutely.
And the reason why is because, especially on religious issues, is because they understood, particularly in Britain, France, Italy, and Spain, how the church had been used as an organ of the state to oppress people. And it wasn't that these guys didn't have some ties of spirituality, that most of them did. Most of them had pews with their names on it in the churches they attended. But it was the understanding that when you're using the church to justify the existing regime, that takes on a whole different meaning. How are you going to fight the regime when allegedly God has put them there, right? And so that's one part of it. I hear people say all the time, you know, Daryl, you know, I want to go back to the founding fathers, just keep it simple. And I'm like, you understand these were human beings who fiercely disagreed on issues in their own time. And by the way, are you sure you really want to go back there? And they always ask me that, you know, what are you talking about? And I'll say, because you're probably going to be disenfranchised. And they get in their eyes start getting a little bigger. And I have to tell them, most white Americans were illiterate in 1789. They did not own property. Most compulsory education didn't start in the South until after the Civil War. And it was only because of the Reconstruction governments that you really had that buildup there. Do you really want to go back to that? Because you stand to lose a lot. And by the way, your women will not be able to vote either.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
you know, those basic things that they don't really get.
Or they've gotten things have been so corrupted in the telling to make it more palatable. So you mentioned Jefferson, and I don't know how many times the story of Sally Hemings comes up, and this idea of were they in love? Were they not in love? Was it enough? And what gets left out of that understanding of that scenario is the power dynamic, right? The coercion, the arguably close, but also consensual or potentially not dynamics that were at play there, you know, likely not consensual. And so even when there are little nuggets of reference that are rooted in truth, we often see, in order to make it easier or more pleasant, you know, kind of a retelling, which doesn't do people favors. It doesn't make a stronger, more thoughtful citizenry.
No.
It doesn't make more active and engaged citizens. It really, I don't think people realize how, you know, history education isn't funded really well. It's not spoken of very highly, but truthfully, it's one of the things that makes strong citizens. And I think that our country will continue to suffer, unfortunately, until we equip young people with as much knowledge and as many skills as possible to do tough things. And history is a tough thing.
Yeah, and that's how you get ridiculous comments from people on cable news shows talking about, I can't understand why the ratings would be upset. We've never done anything to anybody. You know, I mean, that kind of thing. And that actually happened, you know, and it's like, okay, you don't know some of the basics of American interference in the Middle East. It's not taking sides. It's just historical understanding of what actually happened there. Whether you like it or not, there's a reason why these people are upset and have been for 60 years. And so we have to, you know, really kind of, you know,
Excuse me.
we really have to, you know, think about that and digest it, because it's not the Black kids that are being hurt. It's not the Hispanic or Latino or Latinx kids that are being hurt. It's all kids. And that includes the white kids.
I like to refer to this as the miseducation of America. And I think you guys have pointed out things that I've heard before. I never once heard any of that stuff when in my high school history class. So right now today, I work as adjunct ETSU supervising student teachers, and for some reason I supervise history classes. And I go in and I sit in the back of the room, and some of the things that come out of these students' mouths, I just shudder, because I think, number one, that is not the full story.
Yeah.
But they learned that information from guess who?
Teachers, parents, community.
These are
You're
student teachers.
Oh,
So they
interesting.
have walked out of their college history classes, their resource classes, their let me teach you how to teach history classes,
Oh.
and they're spouting this stuff. One student of mine popped a picture up on the screen last fall of a European white man standing 1 foot on the top of the African continent and 1 foot at the bottom of that classic picture of Europe taking over Africa.
Yeah.
Popped it up on the screen for a bunch of 7th graders.
Yep.
So I don't want to blame colleges, but where do we stop that of miseducating our soon, you know, our next season of teachers?
Well, you're right on
Go
that.
out there, they're going to teach this crap.
Yeah.
Right. They're not getting that from college professors.
You can walk right out of ETSU.
They're not, there's not a faculty member in my department that would promote that. But they are getting it from somewhere. You're right on.
He is an ETSU graduate. He is an ETSU graduate right now. And I
That's
talked
right.
to him about that.
But did he actually take his history classes from us?
He's an ETSU graduate, yeah.
That doesn't mean he took his classes from us.
Well, he's walking around with his ETSU style.
But I know what you mean, but that doesn't mean he took his history classes necessarily, particularly the foundational ones in the surveys.
But I think
from
the
us.
point though is that even if maybe that didn't occur at ETSU, at other universities perhaps, or colleges that are producing teachers, that maybe something is happening in that. I agree with you. In my classes, that's not my experience, but I have had students who have come in who are going into history education who have expressed white supremacist values, who have rejected whatever evidence I've put in front of them. And so it becomes difficult too, because and I'm not talking about, my students in particular that I've encountered, but I think that you do run into, you encourage thought, you encourage critical thinking, but contrary to what universities often get accused of, we're not trying to tell people what to think necessarily. We're trying to get them to think and presenting them the evidence. And unfortunately, we see a lot of people who go through that process unchanged. And I do think that early conditioning from family and community members, from public school education, I really do think it cements a lot of those thoughts to the point where when we get them, a lot of that damage is done. Now it's not acceptable, because we need to do better. And this is a call, I say to the history field generally, both in public history, in museums and historical societies and exhibits and programs and tours, and in college classrooms. I mean, we just need to do better across the field of history in the type of history that we're creating and promoting.
But I agree with you. I think there is a bit of nullification that is happening there when the parents and the politicians and the others are getting them. And then, as you said, they're going through their unchanged. So you and I go in the classroom, we give them the straight dope, so to speak. But they are clearly, and we're watching this, whether it's in history classes or others, they're not paying attention at all. They're paying attention to the grade. But some of them, you can almost see it in their eyes. They're trying to acquire as little information as they possibly can because they really don't care.
No.
And that's not all students, but it's a significant amount of
regardless of race. And I have noticed this too, even in my Black history classes and my survey classes, students are worried about their grade, about getting by, about checking that box, because most of the time history does not factor into their life. And so I think part of our goal too is often just trying to argue and persuade about the relevance of history to the point where by the time you've kind of sold them on that idea, maybe you've got 4 weeks left or 3 weeks left. I don't know how, I'm sure you've seen the same thing where the light bulb comes on, but you were in the 1970s, 1980s content wise, and they would benefit from having to go back. But it's an attitudinal thing too, I think. I mean, I really do. In my experience, and I'm sure in yours too, I think one of the problems is attitudinal, and that can be a comment on higher ed in general. The purpose of why students believe they're there. What are they trying to get out of it?
Politicians have told them that they're only there to get a job.
To get a job, exactly. So,
and that's not the purpose of higher education. And the higher education is much deeper and broader than that.
The spirit's more civic. The spirit's more, absolutely.
And teaching people to be young men and women to be leaders, to be responsible community servants and participants, to be civilized. And that's a harsh thing to say, but to be civilized, right? And then the politicians are telling them it's bad, right? It's bad. But notice one thing: very few of those politicians didn't go to college, and they all send their kids to college. Whether it's ETSU or it's the University of Tennessee at Knoxville or the University of Memphis or Vanderbilt, they send their kids to college. They recognize on some value, but guess what? Higher education and education as a whole is a convenient punching bag. And it's not because higher education is liberal. I don't know about your experience, but I can't find more reactionary people than in higher education. They are fixated on where they were when they got their degree. and they have not moved. And for historians,
they've been traumatized to that point.
Historians are never smarter than the day they pass their comprehensive exams. It goes downhill from there. Like, we're right there on that day we passed our comps or defended our dissertation. And then after that, we're like, hey, stop changing things. I like the way things work, and, educators are like that. I mean, I'm still hearing teachers years and years later, K-12, complaining about the new ways that they're instructing teachers to use on how to teach math, right? Which I don't blame them on. Some of that's awful. But it's not the new changes that pisses a lot of them off. They don't want to do anything different than what they already were trained to do initially, right? And that's the same for us. However we were trained, we don't want to deviate too far from that because that's our comfort zone. I mean, we saw this with online education. I was promoting this in my department back in, 10 years ago. And I had a couple colleagues who just hated it. And then the pandemic happened. They realized they could do the same thing from home. and suddenly fell in love with it.
Mm.
You know, oh, this may not be so bad after all.
And to bring exactly what you're saying back, I think to bear to our main topic is to being wrong with grace.
Yeah.
Being wrong with grace. And I think that we've lost that both in terms of, you know, community, being in a community and as people and in higher ed.
Yeah.
I don't see a lot of people, from my students to the general public that we work with sometimes occasionally, and even with colleagues, being wrong with grace, you know, being curious to discover how you potentially were wrong, how you could be right or more right moving forward, and being comfortable with the fact that you don't know everything, and that life is a learning process. You know, be a lifelong learner, be curious and be open-minded. And I think that too is what's shutting down a lot of the potential and the benefit of and the appeal of Black history for a lot of folks is in many ways they would understand that they might be wrong about things. It's really, really hard to counteract that.
And we put too much focus to go along with that on certain aspects. So we'll focus on, you know, initial European contact. We'll talk about the Middle Passage fleetingly. Then we'll talk about tobacco and sugar and cotton. And then we'll say, okay, there was a bunch of white people got upset over this. They're called abolitionists. And then we had a great war about it. And then after that, things weren't so hot, but then we had a civil rights movement in the 50s and everything worked out.
Mhm.
That's kind of the thing there. And it's,
Happily ever after.
yeah, everything's been good. I'm not, you know, and you'll hear people, I'm not sure why the Black people are upset.
Well, and Black
know.
history stops in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's so interesting too, because, you know, when that trend started, I think, you know, we were even closer to those decades, but now we're 40 and 50 years removed. And, you know, a lot of people don't realize that they're losing out on 40 plus years of Black history, contemporary and recent Black history. So I have students, you know, we'll go into the Black experience in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
You know, we'll talk about globalization. We'll talk about the crack epidemic. We'll talk about pop culture's reflection of Black life. And it's mind blowing because they don't think of that as the next chapter after civil rights. You know, it just ends there. And
yeah, King dies and that's it.
Right.
Yeah.
And there is no Malcolm X.
Right. Yeah, they don't want to talk about Malcolm.
And that's that part of where do we change that mindset of educators? I go back to teachers because teachers, I'll call you out, Science High School, history teachers at Science High School are teaching today based on what they learned from their college teachers, their college professors. And it's just like you said, we don't want to change anything. This is, even though there's tons of information out there, people can read it on their own.
Yeah.
But if that's not what I'm supposed to talk about, better not. So we, just like you said, I think you mentioned, you said white history stopped at Civil War. Is that what you said earlier?
Black history stops at the civil rights movement. Yeah.
It's like that's where everything stops.
And that's where the test
Unless-
stops too.
Yeah.
That's where the standardized test stops.
Right.
And that's the
Right.
other thing.
All of that stuff coming forward, Black people want to talk about it. So
But it's the date. You know, what's the date of the civil rights bill? Okay,
64.
1964, it's under Johnson. But we're not talking about the bigger themes. You know, that date regurgitation across history education is
It's
problematic. But with Black history in particular, you're distilling down much more important, much larger
Right.
themes into little nuggets of memory that are on their own irrelevant. I mean, out of context, it's, you know, it's not going to do what it should do.
That's right. And, you know, when we talk about K through 12 teachers, particularly at the high school level, you know, part of the issue is, yes, we can do better to get away from the date type of, you know, method of teaching. You know, this happened in 1492. But the truth of the matter is that it's not just the academic departments like history that are problematic at times on this. It's also the colleges of education that are guiding them in part based on state standards for this kind of education. And so they don't want to go into certain areas. They don't have the freedom to teach the way that I do because they work in the K through 12 system. So they can't choose their own books. They can't choose how they're going to lecture. They can't choose their interpretive, prerogatives there. And that becomes deeply problematic. And then you add on top of that there's little in the way of preventing them from skewing those state standards in a way that is deeply ugly,
Mhm.
which is what you see in a lot of areas, particularly a lot of isolated rural areas where there's little diversity. So they skew it deliberately. And there's no penalty for that because that aligns with what the politicians and the educational bureaucrats who are helping to promote that nonsense in the first place. And so, I'm pretty proud of the work that we do at ETSU. I'm proud of the work that the Clemmer College of Education does in the Department of History, where I'm a faculty member, what the work we do. But if we're going to be honest, this is really a problem that we all have blood on our hands.
Well, and public history is the same way, and I think museums and historic sites also, because things have been done a certain way for a certain period of time, or they view certain community members as stakeholders, or boards are of a certain mindset. I mean, we see hesitance in these public forms of interpretation of history. And so, aside from the classroom, I think that that practice is compounding and reinforcing some of these other things that folks are getting. So, it's interesting because I see a lot of folks thinking that this conversation often gets off track when we go in these directions, but what they don't understand is that, in terms of making Black history more acceptable, more integrated into the mainstream, it's not just a big kumbaya moment. It's structural. It is legislative. It is, there are concrete ways to do that. And so while there needs to be a shift in hearts and minds, as politicians like to say, there also needs to be very tangible, systematic changes.
Right. I agree with that. And two things. One, even those white Americans who are antagonistic towards Black education, towards integrated Black education, they spend a hell of a lot of their time invested in Black people in key ways. Nobody consumes Black music more than whites, period. Nobody consumes it more than white people. You can show up at an ETSU basketball game and it's majority overwhelmingly white, right? Watching a team that is overwhelmingly Black. NFL, 70, 80% Black. Who are the people in the stands? White people, right? It's not that they're not there, but we have to work with some of our fellow Americans on breaking down that fear. And that's important. The second part of it is
Can I just add a quick little bit?
Course.
It has to be collaborative and not consuming.
Yeah.
It has to be a two-way give and take, and not just consumption of Black life and Black culture. It has to be,
Yeah, you're
I think that's
absolutely
great.
right. And then the temerity to get involved and understand that, hey, real life is complex. And sometimes it's ugly. And that's okay too. We've got to figure that out. We're watching this right now in McMinn County, where they have prohibited the use and having the book Mouse in the school library. I guess they're going to find Megan a more family-friendly book on the Holocaust. But
it's too dark. It's too dark
it's too dark.
for Forget the children who lived
can't
through
have
the
that.
Holocaust.
Yeah.
We don't want, it's like what they say about Ruby Bridges. If she's old enough to go through it, your children are old enough to learn about it.
Absolutely.
So.
And, over there in Williamson County, having this very same discussion. They're trying to prevent a book over there, or they just prevented a book that had to deal with discrimination in the state of California. Issues, and they're particularly targeting things that deal with Blacks and things that deal with LGBTQ. And so both of those, and then saying that the kids are too sensitive, or this is too much for the kids to understand. And I keep thinking to myself, Megan, these kids are often watching domestic violence in the home. They're watching drug use in the home. They're watching parents drink to excess. They're watching sex, pornography and otherwise. They're engaging in sex, particularly that saw the teenagers, or in sexual acts. They are watching MMA, which is extreme fighting that often feeds bloodlust, but they're too sensitive to kill a mockingbird.
One thing that I mentioned earlier today was that the folks so I was born in 1960, first grade, 1965. The folks that are grandparents today are the same kids in the 50s and 60s who yelled the N-word and threw the rocks and spit on Black kids who were wanting to go into school. Their grandchildren now are in school sitting next to kids of color And they're learning about what their grandparents did in the late 50s and early 60s. And so this grandkid has to go home and basically say, Mama, Papa, did you do this?
Mhm.
Did you yell the N-word? Did you spit? Did you kick? Did you? And instead of the grandparents saying, yeah, I did, and it was so wrong, and you should never do that, grandparents are instead saying, oh, y'all cannot be talking about this stuff at school. I am not going to talk about what I did
Mhm.
with my grandchildren.
Right.
So people think this is so forever ago.
No.
1960s,
Yeah.
mid-50s. It's just the other day. And
Right.
now these grandkids are learning about what their grandparents did.
Mhm. Well, and not just white men either. And this is
This is
part,
anybody.
this is
Women too.
another thing that, you know, goes along with kind of reconciling with and facing very honestly the past is, you know, white men obviously played a role, especially, you know, in terms of economics and physical violence and exploitation. But white women have a very long history of impeding and being opposed to Black advancement in the United States. Originally, the white suffragists had partnered with abolitionists and chose to leverage racialized fears in order to improve their chance of getting the vote. And then we see later with integration, you know, white moms and homemakers and suburban moms, you know, throughout the late 20th century are the ones who are on the grounds opposing this, you know, who are really involved with local school boards and education and speaking up. And so, you know, I think too that we really just need to investigate this narrative more, and we need to start to attribute and recognize that it's not just a straightforward thing, but that there's a lot of different complicit people in the past. And we have to, like you said, Michelle, you know, acknowledge that without reflecting it on self necessarily. It's not about you. And I think once we get away from that, we'll see the ability to reconcile the people we love potentially, especially for, you know, white Americans, with violence and hate, you know, and at least try to have that cognitive dissonance address some. Not trying to justify it at all, but just saying, you know, if you're sitting across from the table from someone that you love, that begot you and raised you and you've known your whole life, it's going to be difficult to reconcile that with the angry person yelling and pointing fingers and expressing slurs and having signage, you know. So it's going to take a lot of different work on different levels.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you bring up white women, because the civil rights movement in many respects doesn't happen without some collaboration from white women. The Montgomery bus boycott in part succeeds because of white women. But
and the role of Black women in the civil rights movement too, which we often don't discuss.
Absolutely. But there's another way to look at some of the issues regarding white women promoting and doing things that are really difficult for, if you want a fair, equitable, and equal society. And there seems to be some difference in motivation, right? Especially in the contemporary last 30 years or so, where it's not as, it seems like in a lot of these white women that are of that mindset, it's not an issue of raw hatred as it would be understood through their husbands or fathers, something like that. But it's more practical for a lot of these women, meaning they recognize the unequal nature of American society. They understand how deeply problematic it is. But on the other hand, they have husbands, sons, brothers that, right or wrong, they don't want them to lose those advantages. And that becomes really dangerous.
Emmett Till, years later, coming clean about the role that she played in those accusations and protecting, her husband. And absolutely. I mean, I think that, it's painful.
She's still alive.
Absolutely.
And still, hasn't been charged or anything. Just said, I lied.
Well, they admitted that they lied in Life magazine. Just the accountability, and even think of the lynchings and the role, that white women and accusations played in that. And I don't say this to disparage a group of people necessarily, but again, I think that we need to recognize, just throw it out there, but we need to recognize the role that different Americans have played at different times in processes of power, in
Right.
processes of exploitation, in processes of,
Yeah.
being part of a cultural ecosystem. And that's,
Well, I
that's
agree with
important
you,
too.
because
So,
this is about power. And that's the key thing. It's about power. And in the field, in academic history, this is something that's been discussed for a long time, which is the uses and misuses of history.
mhm.
There's entire books written about this,
Mhm.
about how society does this. And right now we're at a very dangerous point where there is an effort underway to sanitize American history so that it basically wipes out these discussions over race, over culpability, over power dynamics, over how this came to be. This is how you get, for example, 20-year-old Black people saying ridiculous nonsense about how racism doesn't exist. This is how you get young white children to do the same. I think of the woman, Candace Owen, the conservative activist, she knows better and she should know better. So that I think there's some opportunism there. But at the same time, what does she know? She's a very young woman.
Mhm.
What does she know? By the time she was in her formative years, it was basically the 2000s. But somebody like Clarence Thomas, who's also made similar arguments, he knows better. So you got to ask, what is the motivation there? And that gets back to the Black community is not monolithic.
Mhm.
This is, the Black community has been participants in some of this for financial reasons, for professional reasons, out of fear. There's a long history of Black people doing things, certain Black people doing things contrary to the interest of other Black
Well,
people.
accommodationism, and that goes back to the Du Bois versus Washington,
Mhm.
argument. And so we have to realize too that these tensions have existed for a long time. They're not new. And also it's interesting because, going back to the creation of Black history, the sharing of Black history, when we think about the preservation movement in the United States for public history and the saving of historic sites and buildings and the preservation of our national history and local history, white women led that charge.
Yeah.
And they preserved a lot of the things from the 1700s, founding fathers, political sites, and Black history sites were not part of the material culture and the built environment that got saved. And so that's the other thing is, we have an established public history, historic preservation field in the United States, but not one that has been inclusive of Black or other minority histories. And so we're kind of behind the 8 ball a little bit in terms of, not that great work hasn't been done, it has, and people have been fighting for this for years. So, credit to the people who have been trying to make this happen, but on a larger scale, we're not seeing the same number or the same frequency or same promotion of Black history sites. And that needs to change too for some of these understandings that change.
Absolutely. And as we think about this, and I know we're at near the end of our hour here, it is important that we do impart what you were saying, which is to be more careful, more deliberative, things of that nature. But it's also important for us to take away some of the passion from this. And for whites and Blacks, that's a hard thing to do. That's a very hard thing to do. There's been multiple efforts over the last 30 years to have conversations around race. And they usually devolve into fights, verbal fights. The other part of that I think is important as well is that we need to focus less on these kind of calendar events like Black History Month, Women's History Month, things of that nature, because what it does for so many people is it allows them to divorce themselves from the issue for the 11 months of the year.
It's also used as marketing.
Yeah.
Like I just see so many advertisements and like businesses being like, all right, we got our Black history done for the year.
Anymore.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Check. Done.
Yeah, that's right.
Women's history's next. I gotta get some female stuff
Yep.
out.
Pride Month was a similar experience.
Yep, that's right. I mean, it's, and I say it in a joking tone, but I'm dead serious. It's Find a Black Person Month. Next month will be Find a Woman.
Native
Yeah.
American heritage.
Yep.
Yeah.
Find a Latino. Then it'll be, of course, the let's find a gay, trans, or lesbian woman or person.
Get one of those that hits all the boxes,
Yeah.
you're good.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And people will actually say that sometimes.
Get
They'll say, you
one.
check 3 or 4
Get one
categories.
good.
Yeah.
So, we have to think about this in a much more thoughtful, deep way
Mhm.
that is, going to illuminate these issues and improve our current circumstances. Let's put it this way. You don't have and it goes back to what you said earlier about history education. We have to do a better job there. And then, Michelle, what you were talking about in terms of us teaching and being better at it, we got to do better there, because if we do better in that way, and we start as a society valuing that, then you don't have a mob of thousands of treasonous Americans attack the U.S. Capitol.
Mhm.
You just don't. And so you combine that with a type of information literacy, along with the ability to learn how to differentiate between what is propaganda, what is misinformation, and what is fact. That's important as well.
Mhm.
And people just have to display some intellectual humility. If those of us who are in professional history, one thing that we know when we teach our students and was taught to us is that no matter how accomplished you are in your field, in your subfield of history, no matter how many books you write, you will only know that much. You will only
It's
know
so
that much.
depressing and so true.
So you should display some intellectual humility and
Mhm.
recognize, I don't know this. I did that the other day, Megan,
Yeah.
in class on Tuesday. I told a student asked me a question. I said, I don't know the answer to
I
that.
don't know. Yep.
And you could see for some of the newbies in the class, freshmen, they're like, he said he didn't know.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, it added to the rapport back and forth, because I was able to say, you know what, I don't know that. Let me go look it up for you. Instead of, hey, yeah, I know that.
Mhm.
One more question.
Yeah, I was
Sure.
gonna say, can we answer any more briefly? But because I
Historians talk a lot.
So the one thing that if you could take about 5 seconds to think about the answer, if you could tell us something about local Black history, Washington County Black history, that this is something you probably didn't know.
Yeah.
What would you tell us?
First of all, it's here. I think a lot of the portrayals of Appalachia are very Scots-Irish focused. We don't think of Appalachia for some reason as a diverse place, but it always has been.
Mhm.
Some of the early explorers through Spanish America in Florida and through the Appalachian region were Black. They accompanied Cortez and others. And
Mhm.
so, we have much more cultural and racial diversity than I think we realize. So it's here. The other thing is, I think people confuse Appalachia with the South a lot, and they assume we had a plantation-based slavery system, but because of our mountainous topography, we didn't. And so we have to reframe the Black experience in Appalachia to reflect that and to understand more African Americans were involved in industry, railroad, farming, coal mining, and try to understand what that means for the Black experience versus kind of the more predominant understanding we have of the Deep South and of, cotton and rice and tobacco based enslavement. I would say that the Heritage Alliance in Jonesboro is a fantastic resource for some Black history. Happy to talk more about the Ford case, where the Black descendants of a white family actually won out in court for the property of the father figure, which is pretty neat. The Alfred Ray home and the Buffalo Soldier history that's local here. Black women actually who turned out to register to vote in large numbers in 1919 when the local government was trying out female suffrage. So Black women of all ages were represented in that initial voting registration. So I would say
The McKinney Center?
yes, and the McKinney Center, absolutely. So visit your local cultural and history sites, visit the Heritage Alliance, visit the McKinney Center, visit the Langston Center, contact Black American Studies, go to the people in the area that are doing Black history and work with them, ask them, interact with them, see what they're coming up with. For instance, shameless plug, Heritage Alliance has a history happy hour event March 10th at 6:30 at Langston. So just expose yourself to the histories that folks are working on, and you'll be very surprised at what you discover.
I agree. I'm not going to add too much to that. I would say the Department of History, specifically myself and a couple of the others who specialize in this area, Black American Studies, where I'm director, the McKinney Center, the Heritage Alliance, the Langston Center, are all excellent resources in this regard. I would also say that while it is true that we did not have the type of slavery in Northeast Tennessee that you would have in Memphis, because of the topography issue, in part, we still had those issues regarding race here. There were people lynched here. There was land taken from people here. And you can see that in Johnson City, for example, near where the golf course is along University Parkway. It's just one example of that. And so it's about being curious and being bold and being brave. Look, American history is not for the meek. It is fascinating, and it is, when you look at, at how the country developed, we have something unique that the rest of the world does not have, which is the race issue. Slavery had been there for thousands of years, but it never existed in the way that it existed here. And the unique way that it existed here allowed for this really rich, from a historian's perspective, tapestry of, intersecting relationships and alliances and families and things of that nature. I mean, it still goes on to this day. I mean, we're still seeing this. Black American Studies just had an event on Tuesday night in which a speaker there found out when he was 40 years old in 1992 that he had a white family on the other side, and that one of them made him the great-great-grandson of a Civil War officer, Confederate officer, whose statue was taken down in the last 2 years in Richmond. You can't make that up. And of course, the descendants in him are, thick as thieves, so to speak, trying to, figure each other out, their family, they acknowledge it, they embrace it, and we have to do that. At the end of the day, we are all human beings. We need love, we need sex, we need family, we need protection, we need education. And that doesn't change because somebody is a lesbian or a trans. That doesn't change because somebody is Black. That doesn't change because somebody's Asian or Latinx. That doesn't change because somebody is a woman or an immigrant or a Native American. We are all human beings. And so we spend a lot of time in this country talking about history and talking about preservation. We only tend to get nervous when it includes Black people, especially. And so if you can be as interested in the Battle of Grandfather Mountain or whatever, you can be interested in other parts of history as well.
Well said.
Awesome.
Very,
Thank
very
you
cool.
both so much.
Thank you.
I hate to stop you. Honestly, I could listen for a long time. And Brittany already said Black history is not just a month, so you're welcome to come back and talk.
Oh, thank you.
But
Yes.
one thing we didn't get to plug that I want to do really quickly is next week, the McKinney Center, the Langston Center, the Heritage Alliance, and Black American Studies will be hosting an event on February 16th at 10 a.m. and it's usable pass. And we have some amazing guests, including Beth Kelly from Colonial Williamsburg and Gary Sandling from Monticello. And we have a guest as well. I can't remember.
Kim
her name.
Floyd
Kim
from Vance
Floyd
Birthplace. Yep.
From the Vance Birthplace. And it is called Sites of Reconciliation, Empowerment Through Challenging Histories. That is a free workshop or panel. You just have to register exactly like you did tonight. So if you want to hear more talk like this, I would encourage you to attend that event as well.
Zoom again, correct?
Yes, it's Zoom, same thing.
And thank you all to the viewers who tuned in. I mean,
Yes, everyone said, great
Yes.
job.
Thank you.
They're lucky to have you in our region. We heard that as
That's very
well.
kind.
So,
Well,
yeah.
thank you so much. I want to thank Michelle and thank Sky for this. Really want to thank you, Megan, for being here and for doing this with me. You're a dear colleague, and I appreciate your views on this and your expertise in these areas. And while we haven't worked out the final dates and stuff, you will be speaking at ETSU
Yeah.
in the very near future for the Black American Studies program about your research about these intersections between criminal justice and Black Americans. And so please take a look at the Black American Studies website in the weeks to come, where we will post information. And I also want to put out there, feel free to contact us. I have people who reach out to me still who are, basically just me. I mean, they agree with me on 95% of things. And I still have people who disagree with me on almost everything. And we still communicate. And so keeping those lines of communication open where they're respectful on both sides is important. Be a part of the solution, not the problem. It's about humility, yes, but it's also about civility and treating one another with respect, even when we ferociously disagree.
Well, and Dr. Carter too needs to be commended for being as vocal and as engaged as you are. And I think that, folks often ask, what can I do? Support the Black American Studies program, support the speakers and the programs, and show up and share and like and engage and, support the people who are doing this work. And Dr. Carter is definitely one of those people who deserves as much encouragement and as much acknowledgement and appreciation as possible. So, on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for everything you do. And thank you both for having us. But, it may feel overwhelming to do something more than listen to talks like these, but I promise that listening is the best approach. And there's lots of opportunities around here to continue to listen and learn. So
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, folks. Thank you so much. This is great.
And Brittany will be back next month, and we'll be back next month. So we'll keep you updated. And thank you. And I hope you have a good night.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
Happy Valentine's Day.